Good morning, everyone. I am in Daegu, South Korea, and today's live chat is about immersive medievalism. It's going to be about my experiences, but also I'm going to provide you with some tips and tricks for how to really get into the medieval environment, as it were. Basically, a little bit of housekeeping first off. If you have any questions as I'm going along, or even to start with, please go ahead and pop them in the chat. And if you haven't already and you're interested in doing so, please do hit the thumbs up button. It helps get my videos in front of more people, et cetera, et cetera. You know how it goes. So I have been doing a medieval living history for, it's 2022, so 27 years now, 27 and a half years now. And I started actually because I'd been fascinated with medieval culture and society and history basically for as long as I can remember. My earliest memories from childhood are reading books on medieval Europe, but also because there's an escapist attitude or an escapism about it. And obviously, when I say escapism, I'm talking about the more beautiful, courtly aspects of the Middle Ages. Obviously, every period of history comes with its drawbacks, including the modern world. So what we're going to be talking about today is recreating and immersing yourself in the more elegant, beautiful, productive, peaceful aspects of medieval culture. So then what is immersive medievalism? Well, there's different ways to do living history. You can, and to me, living history is a spectrum, right? There's everything from just trying out a medieval recipe in your modern kitchen, for instance, using whatever equivalents you can find easily, all the way through to dressing as a cook would have in 1406 in the court of King René of Anjou, and using only the implements that that cook would have used, maybe even in a kitchen in a 15th century chateau in France, creating exactly recipes from a menu from 1406, right? So there's this whole broad spectrum in between on approaches that can be taken, because for me, living history is about living the history, experiencing it firsthand in real life instead of just reading about it or looking at pictures of it, right? So that's living history. Oh, il piacere è il mio, Tommaso, I should say. Right, so immersive living history is then, in my opinion, not just experiencing the objects and activities from a modern viewpoint or a modern focal point, but from trying to put yourself into the medieval mindset, the mindset of a person in the era of your interest. Or that's one approach. The other approach of immersive medievalism is trying to view your modern world, the world around you, everything around you, from the perspective of someone who may have lived in that era. So that's immersive medievalism. And there's a variety of ways to go about it. And there are actually, believe it or not, philosophies about this. And some people believe that immersive medievalism is only that which ignores and denies the existence of anything in the modern world, and that you can only talk about things exactly as your medieval persona would have, for instance, or your Renaissance persona, or whatever history your persona is. But I personally, immersive medievalism for me doesn't do that, because the Contessa, that's me, she's not just a medieval woman. That's sort of me. That's me all the time. As someone says, I'm the Contessa, whether I'm wearing a sun hat or as the Victorians called it, a hennin. But what that means is that if I'm at a medievalist event and we're having a conversation, I don't see any reason that we can't talk about our real modern lives, but in a medieval context, because there are ways to frame everything that's modern in the way that a medieval person would have understood. So immersive medievalism for me is therefore creating sort of a medieval idyll, this environment, this almost magical environment into which you can step, that softens the edges, that allows you to experience dancing and eating and combat and all of these medieval activities, but in a holistic context, but doesn't necessarily deny the existence of the modern one per se. But it's all about how you discuss it that matters. And we'll get to that later when we talk about tips and tricks. So for those just joining us, if you have questions at any time, please pop them in the chat or comments, whatever. I will respond to them. Otherwise, I've actually drawn up a little outline of things we're going to discuss today, just in case no one asks questions. Okay, so immersive medievalism, why do it? Well, for some people, and I know a lot of people personally, actually, who don't enjoy immersive medievalism, they're perfectly happy to experience medieval activities, recreate medieval objects, etc., eat medieval foods, without creating this sort of magical framework, as I call it. And they're uncomfortable, kind of engaging in more of a role play aspect of the immersive aspect. And in fact, I know, people like to shy away from the term live action role playing, but if you go to living history villages, like say Plymouth Plantation in the US, or there's several in Denmark, there's one where the year is literally 1391, people there, all of their conversations, everything they do, their interactions, at least when people are around to see them, are as though they were a person from that era. So even the serious living history interpreters engage in this sort of play, really. So don't let anyone denigrate immersive medievalism, right? So why do it? Well, for me, it is about the escapism. But it's also about being able to experience these objects, these activities, these these foods, etc., in a more holistic context, to really get a better feel for them, to get closer to them. Because what fascinates me about history has always been, how did people live? What was it like to be them in that era? And so for me, immersive medievalism is a way to not just escape sort of the drudgery of the modern world, but also to experience all of that in a more three-dimensional or even possibly four-dimensional manner, right? Comment was, you sound like my medieval history professor who asked what would a medieval person recognize in this room other than my chainmail. And it's funny, in my view, a medieval person would recognize a lot of objects, but they might not identify them correctly. They would find equivalents for them from their own frame, right? It's not that they wouldn't necessarily look at a TV, for instance. I've got the crackling fireplace on the TV right now on Netflix because I really like it and we don't have a fireplace. They would look at that and they probably wouldn't think it's a magical object. That's nonsense. They would probably think it's some kind of wondrous mechanical device, because guess what? Since the ancient world, we've had wondrous mechanical devices that do wondrous, amazing things, and no one really believed they were magical, right? Except for maybe a very few gullible. Anyway, so immersive medievalism, for me, it's always been about creating sort of that magical world. And for me, it's about the courtly world, but that doesn't have to be. There are plenty of people who enjoy doing peasant living history. I mean, really, you might not think that, but they do. They enjoy going and working a medieval farm. And actually, I wouldn't mind going and working a medieval farm for a season. I think that would be a very interesting experience. Or go and work on building that castle in Burgundy that they're actually rebuilding using only medieval methods. I think those would be very interesting experiences too, and made all the more interesting if you're actually interacting in the way that, say, peasants would have interacted in that era and discussed things in the manner in which they would have discussed them or framed them through their lens. Right, so where can you encounter immersive medievalism? Well, as I mentioned, living history villages. They are doing it, not just necessarily medievalism, but immersive living history. Any living history village is probably going to do it. In the United States, we've got Plymouth Plantation. There's sometimes at the Jamestown settlement, they do it. There are certain pioneer settlements on the West Coast that do it. So you can experience it that way as a spectator, but if you want to experience it yourself, there are a number of events where the whole purpose is to immerse yourself and to step out. And in the Society for Creative Anachronism, which for those who may not know is a medievalist organization, started in the US, has branches kind of all over the world, Europe and Australia and Asia. There are events that specifically focus on that. Or events where there's a section of the event where that is the purpose, where you step into a specific area and the goal is to step away from topic discussions of blatantly modern things, modern objects, modern subjects. So at the Penzic, which for those who don't know is this massive event in Western Pennsylvania, 10 to 12,000 people a year, there are certain encampments where that is the case. The Enchanted Grounds is a famous one. And I, for instance, host at that event in a picnic. It's called the Enchanted Picnic. And the whole idea is that we're picnicking and we're dancing and we're telling stories and we're singing songs and we're eschewing conversations that discuss blatantly modern topics, which is not to say we are eschewing modern topics. Keyword there is blatantly. And you just have to know if you're going into someone's encampment whether those are the rules. And if you enter their encampment, you should try to honor those rules. Otherwise, maybe if you need to talk to someone, ask if they'll come out to you. Let's see. So some comments here. Arthur C. Clarke had a wonderful description of how Leonardo would do television. Yep, for certain. And then we've got a costume designer for a festival in Texas. And she's interested in the clothing of the period and modern fabric that can, oh yeah, that is. So we'll talk about cheats and techniques here in a little bit. Right, yeah, so there are actually, so I have a whole series of videos on what I call the Contessa's cheap tricks. I'll see if I can get my husband to dig those up and then I can drop the links and I can drop them in the comments. Because yeah, so immersive living history for me does not mean